The town gathered the way it always did. Quietly, carefully, pretending not to stare while never looking away. Dust rolled low along the main street, stirred by boots and wagon wheels, settling into every crease of the wooden buildings like it belonged there. Judgment lived in that dust. It always had. She stood near the mercantile, hands clasped tight at her waist, shoulders drawn inward as if she could make herself smaller. The women didn't look at her directly. They never did. Their whispers traveled instead, sharp and practiced. She can't bear children. No use to anyone. A barren woman brings trouble. The shopkeeper didn't raise his voice when he turned her away. He didn't need to. Got no work, he said flatly, eyes already moving past her. The church door stayed closed. The charity wagon rolled on without slowing. Rejection didn't come like a slap. It came like cold, slow, thorough, impossible to escape. She nodded once, as if she'd expected nothing else. Pride kept her spine straight, but something in her eyes cracked. Not tears. Something deeper. The knowledge that no matter how hard she worked, how much she endured, the town had already decided what she was worth. Across the street, a man leaned against a hitching post, watching. The cowboy looked worn in a way that had nothing to do with age. His coat was patched, his hat pulled low, his jaw set in a permanent line of restraint. 5 children waited for him back at a lonely homestead beyond the ridge. 5 lives balanced on his shoulders like a weight he never set down. He knew the sound of whispers. He knew what it meant to be measured and found lacking. He saw the way she stood alone once the murmurs died. How the street seemed wider around her. How silence pressed harder than any insult. For a long moment he did nothing. Then he pushed off the post. Bootsteps crossed the dust. The town watched now, openly curious. He stopped in front of her, blocking the wind without meaning to. She looked up, startled, ready for another refusal. He spoke low, firm, not unkind. I got a place, he said. A hard one. Full of noise and trouble. 5 kids who don't listen and don't sleep much. She swallowed. I can't. I know. He cut in gently. That ain't what matters. The town held its breath. If you want, he went on, you can come home with me. 1 sentence. 1 choice. And just like that, the cruelty of the frontier met something it didn't expect. Defiance, quiet and unmovable. The homestead sat low against the land, weathered boards pressed into the dirt as if the house itself was tired of standing. When the cowboy brought her through the door, the sound that met them wasn't silence. It was life, unruly and loud and unfinished. Boots thudded on the floor. A chair scraped. Someone argued over a crust of bread. This was not a place made for strangers. It was already stretched thin. 5 children turned to stare. The eldest stood first, shoulders squared, too young. Eyes sharp with a fire that had learned to burn before it learned to trust. Beside him, a quiet girl lingered near the wall, fingers worrying the hem of her dress, watching without blinking. A smaller boy sat on the floor, rocking slightly, gaze unfocused, as if the world had once shouted too loud and never stopped. Near the stove, a child barely older than the rest moved with careful purpose, wiping, stirring, tending, maternal not by nature, but by necessity. The youngest stayed half hidden behind a chair, withdrawn, peering out as though people had a habit of leaving. The woman felt the weight of every eye. This house already carried grief like a second roof. There was no room for her mistakes. No space for weakness. I ain't promising nothin', the cowboy said, voice firm but low. You stay, you work. You don't raise your voice, and you don't try to be something you ain't. She nodded quickly. I won't be trouble. The eldest scoffed. They always say that. The cowboy shot him a look. Enough. Boundaries were laid like fence posts. Clear, rigid, necessary. 1 week, he said. A trial. She could leave after. He would not force her to stay. He would not let her stay if it harmed the children. That night, supper was eaten in tight silence. The woman kept her hands folded when they shook. The children watched her the way animals watch a new shape enter the pasture, uncertain if it meant safety or threat. Later, as lantern light flickered and the wind pressed against the walls, she lay awake listening to the house breathe. To whispered arguments. To soft crying cut short. This house was already too full. And yet, somewhere between fear and necessity, a fragile space had opened, one where trust might grow, if no one reached for it too fast. Morning came hard at the homestead. Not gentle, not forgiving. Just the scrape of chairs on the floor, boots thudding, 5 voices talking over one another like the house itself might split if they didn't get their noise out early. The woman stood at the edge of it all at first, hands folded, unsure where to place herself. She wasn't asked to help. She helped anyway. Stirred porridge. Mended a tear. Learned which cup belonged to which child by the way they reached for it. Resistance softened in inches, not miles. The fiery one challenged her with sharp looks and sharper words. The quiet one watched from corners, measuring every gesture. The broken one clung too tightly, afraid of being left again. The maternal one tried to manage everyone, far too young for the weight she carried. And the withdrawn one barely spoke at all. The woman didn't force herself on them. She waited. She listened. She stayed. At night, when the house finally went still, pieces of her past slipped out in the firelight. Not all at once. Never in order. A sickness that stole her chance at bearing children. A doctor's words spoken too cold, too final. The way people's faces changed when they learned. How kindness dried up fast when usefulness did. They said I was empty, she murmured once, staring into the flames. Like that was all I was meant for. Shame had followed her longer than grief ever did. The cowboy never pressed her. He knew what it was to live with a thing you couldn't fix. Some evenings, when the wind rattled the walls just right, his own story surfaced without warning. His wife's laughter gone too soon. The fever that took her. 5 small faces looking to him afterward, waiting for answers he didn't have. He spoke of fear, not of bullets or men, but of failing the only people left to him. I don't get a second chance, he said once. Not with them. The children heard more than either adult realized. They noticed who stayed when tempers flared. Who remembered names, fears, small preferences. The woman learned that one child needed quiet before sleep. Another needed reassurance spoken out loud. Another only trusted hands that didn't rush. She learned that comfort didn't always look like affection. It sometimes looked like consistency. One evening after a long day, the youngest dragged a blanket across the floor and dropped it beside her chair. No words. Just an offering. The cowboy saw it and looked away, throat tight. Something had shifted, subtle but sure. Out here, motherhood wasn't measured by blood or birth. It was measured by who showed up. Who stayed when staying was hard. Who protected, who endured, who loved without guarantee. And slowly, without ceremony, the children began to understand what the frontier never taught them outright. A mother wasn't someone who gave them life. It was someone who chose it again and again. The frontier never stayed quiet for long. Even when the wind laid down and the dust settled, tongues kept moving. Word travels fast in small towns, carried on glances and half-spoken warnings. It wasn't long before they started looking at her differently. Longer stares, colder pauses, voices dropping when she passed. It happened first at the general store. She stood by the counter, counting coins slow, careful, when a woman nearby leaned just enough to be heard. 5 children, she murmured. And he brings that into his house? The word landed heavier than a slap. Another voice followed, sharper. She can't give him more. That's what folks say. Laughter, thin and cruel, slipped between them like a blade. Outside, a man with authority, land papers in his coat, confidence in his stride, offered a warning dressed up as concern. That homestead's already stretched thin, he said, eyes never leaving her face. Wouldn't want trouble finding its way there. Children don't need confusion. The word hung in the air, heavy with meaning. The message was clear. She didn't belong. And if she stayed, consequences would follow. That night she packed her few things. Quiet. Careful. The children slept, unaware of the decision forming in the dark. She stood at the doorway, listening to their breathing, knowing how easily the frontier took what it didn't value. Leaving would be safer. For them. That's what she told herself. The cowboy found her there, bundle in hand. You running? He asked. I won't be the reason they suffer, she said. They already hear enough. He was silent for a long moment. Then he turned, stepped into the light, and the next morning rode straight into town. He didn't shout. Didn't threaten. He stood in the open, voice steady as stone. My house ain't yours to judge, he said. My children ain't yours to measure. And she stays because I say so. The crowd shifted. Some looked away. Some bristled. But the line had been drawn. For the first time, the frontier had been told it didn't get to decide who was worthy of family. The homestead changed its rhythm. It wasn't loud at first. No shouted orders. No panic. Just small adjustments that spoke of experience earned the hard way. The cowboy rose earlier. He checked fences twice instead of once. Loose boards were hammered back into place. A lantern was kept burning longer into the night, its glow steady against the dark pressing in from the plains. The woman noticed everything and acted. She reorganized what little they had. Supplies were counted, not guessed at. Water was rationed. Blankets were mended with careful, patient stitches. She didn't ask permission. She didn't wait for praise. She moved like someone who understood that survival wasn't about strength alone. It was about order, discipline, and refusing to waste what the world rarely gave twice. The children followed her lead, each in their own way. The fiery one volunteered for chores without being asked, jaw set with determination. The quiet child stayed close, handing tools, listening more than speaking. The broken one, who flinched at raised voices, found comfort in routine, measuring grain, stacking wood, finding peace in repetition. The maternal child took charge of the younger ones, echoing the woman's calm. Even the withdrawn one lingered near her, silent, watching, learning trust one moment at a time. At night, they gathered at the table. Meals were simple. Bread. Stew. Nothing fancy. But hands reached across the table now. Bowls were passed without argument. When the wind rattled the walls, the woman's hand found a child's shoulder. When thunder rolled far off, the cowboy didn't sit alone anymore. He stayed present, grounded. Outside, the land watched. Dust storms brewed on the horizon like bad intentions. Riders passed farther out than before, silhouettes lingering just a moment too long. The message was clear. Eyes were on them. Judgment was coming. The cowboy cleaned his rifle by firelight, slow and deliberate. The woman stood nearby, steady as the flame, offering quiet reassurances to the children. Not promises, just truth. Stay close. Listen. We'll face whatever comes. And in that stillness, something settled. This was no longer a house of strangers bound by circumstance. It was a family choosing to stand, choosing each other. Not because it was safe, but because walking away would have meant surrendering to the same cruelty that had already taken too much. Out on the frontier, unity was its own kind of weapon. And they were ready. The trouble didn't come loud at first. It came the way frontier trouble often did, slow, deliberate, meant to be seen. 5 riders appeared on the rise beyond the homestead just as the sun dipped low, their silhouettes cutting black against the dying light. They didn't hurry. They wanted to be noticed. The children saw them first. Dust drifted across the yard, caught in the wind like ash. The cowboy stepped out onto the porch, rifle resting easy in his hands, jaw set. He counted the riders. He always counted. Behind him, the woman stood in the doorway, the youngest child clutching her skirt with white knuckles. The house felt suddenly too small, too fragile. The riders stopped short of the fence. One of them dismounted. A man with authority in his posture, the kind that came from knowing the town, stood behind him. His voice carried easily. "We ain't here for trouble," he said, eyes fixed on the woman. "We're here to set things right." The words landed like a lie dressed up as mercy. He spoke of decency, of order, of how a household with 5 children needed proper care. Then he said it, the thing they'd all been thinking but were too polite to say before. A woman who can't give children ain't fit to raise them. The air went still. The cowboy's grip tightened. His worst fear rose sharp and sudden, not of dying, but of watching his family torn apart piece by piece, like it had been once before. He remembered standing helpless as the world decided things for him. He remembered the sound of loss. "Leave," he said low. The man smiled thinly. "Or what?" The answer came in a crack of gunfire. A warning shot tore into the dirt at the rider's feet. Horses reared. Shouts followed. In seconds, the quiet yard erupted into chaos. The children screamed as the cowboy shoved them back inside. Bullets splintered wood. Windows shattered. The house that had barely held together under peace now shook under violence. Smoke stung the air. The cowboy fired from cover, precise, controlled, fighting not for land or pride but for 5 small lives inside. The riders pressed closer, shouting insults meant to wound deeper than bullets. They called her useless, called her a burden, called her a mistake. Inside, the woman knelt with the children huddled around her. Fear shook her hands, but she didn't run. She didn't hide. She rose. "Stay down," she told them, voice steady despite the thunder outside. She moved with purpose, barring doors, guiding small bodies to safer corners. When the oldest child began to cry, she pulled him close, her voice firm. "Look at me. We're not leaving. Not today." Another shot tore through the wall. The standoff reached its breaking point when one rider forced the fence, dismounting with a torch in hand. Fire was the final threat, the unspoken promise of what came next. The cowboy saw it, and for a heartbeat fear won. He imagined smoke, screams, loss all over again. Then the woman stepped onto the porch beside him. "You want me gone?" she shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Then you'll have to carry me." The riders hesitated. No one had expected her to stand, to claim the ground beneath her feet. "I didn't bear these children," she said, eyes blazing. "But I've bled for them. I've stood between them and the dark. And I'll do it again." The torch fell to the dirt. In that moment the power shifted. The riders saw it too, the truth they tried to bury. This wasn't a woman to be shamed into silence. This was a mother forged by choice. The cowboy fired once more, close enough to make the message clear. The riders retreated, curses fading with the dust. When silence returned, it was heavy, earned. The woman turned back inside. The children ran to her without hesitation, arms wrapping tight. No one questioned it now. No one doubted where she belonged. The cowboy watched them, chest heaving, and understood something at last. Family wasn't given. It was proven. The danger left the homestead the same way it had come, quietly, with its head lowered. The threat was finished now. Whether beaten down by force, shamed into retreat, or driven away by a truth it could no longer hide, it no longer had a hold on that place. The wind moved through the yard again, unafraid. Even the horses stood easier, steam rising from their flanks as the tension bled out of the land. Dawn came slow, pale light spilling over the plains like forgiveness that hadn't been earned but arrived anyway. The woman stepped outside, boots sinking into wet earth as the last of the night's darkness broke apart. Somewhere rain had fallen upriver. Enough to carry the dust away. Enough to promise a new start. The homestead stood scarred but standing. Broken rails could be mended. Windows replaced. What mattered most had not been taken. Inside, the children gathered close to her without being told. One leaned into her side. Another slipped a small hand into hers. The fiery one didn't speak, just nodded once like a vow made and kept. No one said the word mother. They didn't need to. Out here, names mattered less than presence. And she had stayed. The cowboy watched it all from the doorway. 5 children. One woman the world had deemed unworthy. And yet this was the first time the house felt whole. He thought of what the frontier had taught him. That blood decided everything, that loss was permanent, that love was a liability. He understood now how wrong that lesson had been. Family wasn't given. It was chosen. And as firelight warmed the room and the morning claimed the sky, he knew this was the truest thing the frontier had ever taught him. Out on the frontier, people were measured by what they could produce. Strong hands. Strong sons. Women judged by what their bodies could give, not by what their hearts could hold. And when someone fell short of those cruel measures, the land was quick to cast them aside. But the frontier was wrong more often than it cared to admit. That woman had been told she was useless because she could not bear children. The cowboy had been told 5 was already too many mouths to feed. And those children had learned early that love was something that disappeared without warning. Yet together they proved a harder truth. Family is not made by blood alone. It's made by who stays, who listens, who stands between fear and the ones who cannot fight it yet. So let me ask you before the fire burns down, what truly makes a parent? Is it birth? Or is it the hands that steady you when the night gets long? If you had been there, would you have judged her, or chosen her? If this story spoke to you, leave your thoughts here where stories are shared like bread. And if you wish to keep riding these frontier roads with us, through tales of justice, mercy, and chosen family. Then subscribe and stay close. The fire crackles low. Laughter fills the room. And in that warm circle of light, a family once denied finally claims its place.